Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this virtual debate on closing the attainment gap in our school system. I'm Professor Lindsay Macmillan, Professor of Economics and Director of the Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities at the IOE. I'm very pleased to be chairing this evening's discussion with you on an issue that is fundamental to what we are trying to achieve at CPO, equalising opportunities. This evening, we'll be looking at the long-standing gap in levels of attainment between pupils from disadvantaged and more affluent backgrounds, and discussing what can be done to address this in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, this isn't a new issue that has arisen during or since the pandemic came around. This has been the focus point of education policy for decades, and yet we've only seen mixed success. There is some evidence that this gap was narrowing, but even before the pandemic hit, this progress had stalled. Unfortunately, one thing that's become abundantly clear over the past year is that the pandemic has exacerbated this issue. Evidence shows that students from disadvantaged backgrounds have had more limited access to learning resources during school closures. And this is coming through in assessment data of current achievement levels relative to previous cohorts. So what is needed post-COVID? Not only in terms of recovery, but also to tackle that persistent achievement gap that we have lived with for decades. And has our experience over the past year opened up new options for tackling that gap? We've got an esteemed panel of speakers to help us reflect on these issues this evening, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. Once we've heard their opening remarks, we'll move on to comments and questions. Please use Slido's Q&A function to share your views on what you're hearing and post questions to me and to ask our speakers. You can also tweet about the evening using the hashtag IOE Debates. So, to introduce our speakers. First up, we have John Hutchinson. John is the Assistant Head Teacher at Reach Academy, Feltham, and all through school in West London. John's focus is the curriculum and assessment in the primary phase. He's also helped to develop the Reach Out curriculum, which is now taught in over 150 schools. John is a visiting fellow for the Ambition Institute and has advised the DFE, Ofsted and the STA, most recently on the Early Career Framework for Teachers. Next up, we're joined by Ruth Lupton, Honorary Professor of Education at the University of Manchester. Ruth was previously working here at the IOE and at CASE at the LSE, and her research focuses on poverty, inequality, education, and place. February saw the publication of Ruth's fantastic co-authored Nuffield report on post-16 transitions for young people with lower GCSE attainment, and you might have caught the CPO seminar on that in March. This month, she publishes her new book, co-authored with Deborah Hayes, entitled Great Mistakes in Education Policy and How to Avoid Them in Future. Third up, we have Hitan Shah, who is Chief Executive of the British Academy, the UK's National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences. Of course, the British Academy has recently published a wonderful wide-ranging review of the long-term societal impact of COVID, and we'll hear more on this in a moment. Hitan is also a visiting professor at the Policy Institute, King's College London, and sits on the advisory board at Cambridge University's Bennett Institute for Public Policy and the Science Media Centre. He's also vice chair of the Ada Lovelace Institute, a board member of the Legal Education Foundation, and a trustee at St George's House. Finally, last and by no means least, we have Sammy Wright, who's Vice Principal of Southmore Academy in Sunderland and a Commissioner for the Social Mobility Commission. Sammy spent 12 years teaching in schools across London before relocating to the North East 5 years ago, where he set up the first non-faith school-based sixth form in Sunderland and established the North East's first Oxnet hub, which is part of an initiative to increase progression to elite universities by those from disadvantaged backgrounds. I'm delighted to welcome this panel this evening. So I'm going to hand over now to the panel. First over to you, John, for your introductory comments.
Thanks so much. Welcome, everybody. Real pleasure to be here. So I'd like to start off by just considering this motion that's being presented to us. It laments the attainment gap, points to the damage that COVID has done with respect to that gap, although, of course, it didn't require a pandemic for that wedge to exist, because there will always be an attainment gap. The system's designed to guarantee that. And those with the most resources are always going to find a way to secure those top prizes, the grades that open so many doors. We should be entirely unsurprised by all of this. So I'm not even sure that this relative difference is necessarily such a big problem. What I care about most is how low the bar is for those at the bottom. In the same way that I don't know whether I care massively that there are a handful of billionaires. I'm much more concerned about how much those on the lowest incomes are earning. So maybe this attainment gap discussion is a little bit of a distraction. And maybe we should spend more time talking about the minimum entitlement, what we think that all pupils should have. There'll be no shortage of educational disruptors, radicals who assure us that some huge revolution is ready to transform education, that we're relying on a Victorian model of schooling, it's unfit for the 21st century, that an internet connection and a personalized curriculum will save us all. And these ideas are, I think, initially seductive, but time and time again have been shown just to be empty promises. They're promoted by the same sorts of people who went really silent during the pandemic, when the ideal conditions for this unschooling to take place. So if we want to improve education for children and maybe try and narrow this attainment gap or ensure a minimum entitlement, one of the things that we could do is introduce these new things, extended school days, ed tech solutions, tutoring, and maybe they'll help, maybe not. I guess another thing that we could do, though, to improve things for children in school is just to not do bad things. So I'm going to speak as a teacher here about 3 things that I think that we should avoid doing in response to the pandemic and in trying to address the attainment gap. I think, first of all, replacing exams with a different form of assessment is a live conversation at the moment, obviously during this year and last year because of the pandemic, but then ongoing. I think it would be a big mistake. I think that exams remain the most valid, reliable, and fair way of assessing kids. They're the least influenceable by those with the most resources. They give kids a useful indication of what to do next, which subjects or areas they're best suited to, what they might struggle with. And they help us to see nationally how children are performing. For example, we wouldn't know about this attainment gap without that examination data. So I think the first thing that we should do is not abolish examinations. The second thing that we shouldn't do, avoiding bad things, shouldn't narrow the curriculum. Now, this is maybe in tension with item 1 here, because there's going to be a rush to try and perhaps narrow the curriculum, especially in primary school, focus on reading, writing, and maths, those subjects which are externally examinated. But as I said before, I think that all children have an entitlement, all pupils have an entitlement to the accumulated culture, the best that's been thought and said. It's our responsibility to pass on to all kids so far what we've achieved and to help broaden their horizons, to introduce them to ideas that they might not have come up against before. And so we don't think we should narrow the curriculum in a way to try and address the pandemic or the attainment gap that we've seen. And the last one, the bad things that we should avoid, is to revert to less effective approaches to teaching and learning. So I think there's a temptation here to do something whiz-bangy, but we have a good idea about great teaching. It perhaps has a little bit of an image problem, but good explicit instruction, deliberate practice, low stakes quizzing. It's the sort of stuff that we rush to last minute when a kid is behind. So we shouldn't address gaps by doing less teaching. So that's one of the reasons that I'm really excited about the new early career framework, making sure that all teachers have the best available evidence about strong teaching and learning. So at the risk of derailing the motion, maybe we shouldn't be distracted by this attainment gap and instead focus on that minimum entitlement for all pupils and ensure that teaching in classrooms is as strong as it can possibly be, based on the best available evidence of how we should teach and children should learn.
Thank you, John. That was very nice, very clear summary of your main points of what we shouldn't be doing. And a really interesting point there, I think, about our focus on relative versus absolute attainment. Thank you. Ruth, over to you now, if that's okay.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Lindsay. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute tonight. So in the spirit of a good debate, I do want to disagree with John, although we definitely agree on some big points. So I do want to focus on inequalities, and I do think we need a radical policy reset. And I say this because, as you said, Lindsay, the disadvantage gap is a really long-standing, persistent problem into which, even at the best of times, we've only made modest inroads. And in the new book, which Lindsay mentioned, which comes out next week, and which all of you attending can get at a discount price, so watch out for that in the post-event publicity, we argue that the problem that's confronting us now is that education policy over the last 3 decades or more hasn't risen to the challenge of growing social and spatial inequalities that we've seen since the 1980s. So it's become increasingly unfit for purpose as society has changed. So one reason it hasn't risen to that challenge is that other social policies aren't doing their job. I mean, it should be really obvious that we can't, at the same time, drive down the incomes of the poorest families, cut the services that they rely on, and then expect attainment gaps to close. But even when there were stronger social policies in place, this didn't deal with all the problems. So I'm going to focus on narrowly defined education policy and argue that we need to reverse some of the major wrong turns in education policy, which are baking inequalities into the system. And top of my list there are funding formulae which aren't anywhere near weighted enough towards disadvantage. Being too fixated on attainment, here I do agree with John, and therefore having test scores at the centre of the school accountability system. We do need tests, but there's so much more to education than tests, and much more to a notion of educational equity than just test score gaps. And what we've seen is that when tests and accountability become so closely coupled, we end up with things that we don't want: narrowed curriculum, diminished educational experiences. And these things matter more for children whose families are less well resourced. And we create failure early on for children who start off at a disadvantage. So I think in focusing solely on test gaps, we can actually make things worse. And then also on my list is turning to markets and competition to raise standards, because when schools need to compete in order to survive, the interests of the neediest students too often get squeezed out. So if we want to deal with the attainment gap, I think we need to deal with these great big things, not just what works in teaching and learning, although we also need to do that. So here's my hit list. So I think we need a holistic cross-government strategy for equalising childhoods. We can't just let the DFE be over here and everything else over there. We need a broader vision of education, not just academic attainment, and certainly not just English and maths. And that would mean changes to curriculum and also to the accountability system. We need equity to be a really fundamental principle of education policy and practice. And what I mean by that is, we need to look at equal experiences for young people, not just equal outcomes. So this means taking a really hard look at practices like around behaviour, around exclusion, around ability grouping, and so on. And schools should be accountable for those kind of things, not just the grades they produce. We need a much, much bigger redistribution of funds to schools in areas of greatest disadvantage, based on what we know about the different work that schools need to do in different kinds of contexts. And we've learned a lot about that during the pandemic. So I'm talking about paying for class size reduction, equalising extracurricular opportunities, supporting physical and mental health, family support, adult learning, these kind of things. So, basically saying, let's think about what it would really take to level up educational opportunities and do that. And to minimise competition, the last thing, we need to minimise competition and maximise collaboration, probably between schools, starting with shared local accountabilities. So there's a long list, but if that's not enough, I think we'd do better as well if we started formal schooling at 7 and had a universal kindergarten phase, and if we got rid of our exam at 16 and moved to a 14 to 19 phase of education and training. So I'm asking a great many things, but I do think now is the moment to think really big and to forge a new consensus about the education system we want for the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ruth. We often get accused as academics of not coming up with policy solutions, and there's a long list of policy solutions for people to mull over. So that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you. I really like the idea of equal experiences, not outcomes. Really nicely put there. And I love that it's getting juicy already, that we've got some disagreement. So thanks for that too. Okay, Hitan, are you ready to go?
Yeah, thank you. So as you kindly said in your introduction, I'm from the British Academy, and we did a review recently, which Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Advisor, asked us to do on the long-term societal impacts of the pandemic. And in a nutshell, we said, although it was a health crisis, it was clearly a social, cultural, and economic crisis. And despite the vaccine coming on stream, actually the societal impacts could last, we think, for a decade or more. So I'm drawing really on the findings of that report, although there are some other bits of social science as well in responding to today's question. You've already pointed out there was already a significant attainment gap pre-COVID, and I think it's worth starting there. By GCSE age, poorer students were on average 18 months behind their richer peers. So, that was a big issue. From 2007 to 2017, the gap between disadvantaged 16-year-olds and their peers was closing, but only by 3 months over that entire decade. And by 2020, this had come to a complete standstill. The Education Policy Institute argues that this is largely due to the most disadvantaged students and the persistent poverty that they face. So I think that that is something that we need to come back to when we're thinking about what is it we're trying to address and how. Our review around the COVID decade pointed to the fact that the pandemic had, across a range of areas, not just education, exposed, exacerbated, and solidified existing inequalities. And just as an example in the education space, which I think many of you will be familiar with, after the first lockdown in spring 2020, 74% of private schools were giving full-day tuition digitally, whereas only 38% of state pupils were receiving that, and 25% of state pupils were receiving no schooling or tutoring at all. And the Education Endowment Foundation has estimated that growth in attainment gap could be as much as 36% by September 2020. That's the central projection, incredibly uncertain. So, as has already been discussed, you could look at dealing with this attainment gap through initiatives purely in the education system. And my colleagues, I'm not an educationalist myself, colleagues on this panel will know far better than I what you might do about that. But I think Ruth's point about the funding formula is very important to have in the back of your mind in all of this. Let's not forget, over the last decade, 09-10 to 19-20, real-term school funding dropped by 9%. So schools were already in a worse position to be able to deal with the issues that we're facing. But also because of the way that the funding formula has worked, and relative deprivation actually dropped in London, actually the funding formula hasn't followed. The most deprived schools have actually lost out more. But let me turn in my last couple of minutes to a kind of wider view, because if you come back to where I started, which is that poverty and inequality has driven a lot of the problems in closing the attainment gap, you need a wider view on how to tackle all of this. So in our report, we argue for giving young people a much bigger voice in policy making, which they don't have at the moment. A more joined up approach across policy for young people in welfare, in housing, in health, in crime. And this, in a sense, harks back to the days of the Department for Children, Schools and Families, or cushions and soft furnishings, as some of us used to like to remember the acronym by. But it's taking that much more holistic view. And I think digital infrastructure is another area where we really need to invest in order to sort of deal with the digital divide. Thinking about the further education system is really critical as well if we're to look at the most disadvantaged, because coming out of the school system, this is where many of the least most disadvantaged will be going, but that has faced a 12% real terms cut in the last decade as well. And finally, I think we need to look for greater local support through government and civil society. One of the things our report found, one of the strengths of the UK response was at the local level. But thinking about initiatives around youth work, green spaces, play areas, sport, all of these things which can support young people in that much wider way, I think is very, very important. So to conclude, young people have suffered very, very hard in the pandemic, when of course they were least at risk during all of this. And so there is, I think, in some notion of a social contract, a need now to pay back for what they've endured. But a key issue in all of this is that policymakers and in many ways people like us have probably had a relatively good pandemic. People have worked from home, the richer people have tended to save, et cetera, and therefore it's very hard for policymakers to really understand how tough this has been for the most disadvantaged. And that, I think, is a serious blocker to the kind of changes that are actually required. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Hutchinson. And thank you for broadening out the conversation and thinking about things beyond the education system that we might need to be thinking about as part of this debate. Okay, Sammy, last but not least, over to you.
Thank you. So I thought I'd start, being last, it's really interesting because you hear everything everyone else has said. And there was a couple of things which stood out, and I want to kind of address them. One is that several people talked about school curriculum and assessment, and it's important to understand the distinction between assessment and curriculum, and the fact that actually at the moment, perhaps certainly at secondary school, there isn't that much of a distinction, but maybe there could be. So what I mean by that is I'm a firm believer in a broad and balanced curriculum, to use the current phrase, and I think that there's an entitlement for students of all backgrounds to, say, for example, access Shakespeare. I'm a literature teacher. But I think it is unfair to then make the assessment on that the basis for future chances in life. So, there's always going to be a difference in access to the curriculum based on familial experiences. And so therefore, because of that, I think that the assessments that one chooses to then base progression on should have that awareness baked in. So that's one point that just popped into my head as I was listening. Then the other comment, which I think Lindsay already picked up on, was this idea of equal experience, not equal outcomes. And I think that that's where it's important to recognize the distorting effects of our system. So what I mean by this is I've taught in schools which have had a very kind of leafy middle-class catchment area, and equally schools in very deprived areas. And what one finds in schools in very deprived areas where there is a huge pressure on the school is that because of the inevitability of the attainment gap, the teaching is far more geared to the exam. Because the slack cannot be taken up at home, you end up teaching to the test more. So the same grade in one school and in another might represent a very different experience. And in that sense, we actually have to look at that holistic sense of the way that the assessment regime impacts on the teaching and learning in the classroom. So having said that, that was my responses to some things. So let me quickly go through what I wanted to say. It's important to note, and this follows on from things that other people have said as well, that this gap is persistent. Any shift that we've had has not been significant, realistically. It's also important to note that the progress gap, as opposed to the attainment gap, has actually widened every year since 2016. the gap's persistent across Ofsted categories. So outstanding schools have the same gap as inadequate schools. And all of this gives us a picture of a really intransigent problem. Now, as such, when I joined the Social Mobility Commission as a teacher, I kind of went in with my agenda, and straight away I asked some really straightforward questions. I said, who, now I've got access to all this research capacity and data, who's closing the gap? So we set up a research project, and that's going to be published in about 3 weeks' time. And it was looking at which schools were closing the gap. So we looked right across the country, and in secondary schools, we found 11 schools that were closing the gap persistently on a 3-year trend. And of those 11, 5 were grammar schools with 2 or 3% free school meals, and the other 6 were failing. So everyone was doing badly. And this gives us a really clear picture, doesn't it? So we looked, we were a little bit less stringent than the 3-year trend, and we looked and we tried to see other things, other commonalities. And I'm going to quote from the report. And one of our main recommendations is simply to say that the Department for Education should recognize that there is no single well-evidenced strategy that can be implemented to reduce the progress gap, and should develop a longer-term strategy to address socioeconomic disadvantage in schools. There is no magic bullet. We really looked hard to find it, and it was the most extensive piece of research that anyone's done so far on this. I think maybe there needs to be more research, but we could not find a commonality in strategies. And also we found that schools face very different circumstances, very different types of disadvantage. And actually, if we were looking for anything that we might draw out of it, trying to be helpful about this, perhaps the only thing that we could draw out is attendance. That actually one should focus on getting kids into school, and then other things flow from that. So there's some really tricky things here about, we are looking at the disadvantage gap as if it is this big monolithic thing, when actually it's a million different gaps, and they have to be addressed by schools with nuance and subtlety in their areas. But what I want to just finish on is, all the things that I've said point towards one conclusion to me. And that is that if the best schools in the country are not doing this, it cannot be done. And as such, we are barking up the wrong tree if we are simply thinking of new ways that schools can change their approaches and try and adapt their teaching and learning, etc. And maybe if we really want to eradicate the disadvantage gap, instead of focusing on the gap bit, let's focus on the disadvantage bit. Let's remove disadvantage. Let's take away the child poverty that leads to trauma, that leads to adverse childhood experiences, that leads to disengagement with school, and then see if that will make a difference.
Fantastic, Sammy, thank you. I was too enthralled in what you were saying there to jump in time, but really interesting. Thank you so much. I'm astounded actually by that finding, and it's good food for thought for us. So let's move on to some questions. I'm going to use Chair's privilege to ask some questions directly myself first. And as part of this debate, we asked some polling questions on Twitter before the event, asking, do you think the attainment gap can be closed by a more generous welfare provision alone and by education policy alone? And the overwhelming response to both of those questions was no. So, Sammy, I'll come to you first, if that's okay. Given your closing comments about actually the role of education policy and the role of, dealing with the disadvantage problem in itself, how do you see the balance between welfare and education policy playing out here?
I think we need to think of this all together, as one piece. And I think, I would compliment you on the fantastic long shadow deprivation report from October, which we worked together on. And that was a fantastic piece of work, because what it identified very clearly was that in some areas, education can level up, as it were, and can, give opportunities. But there are some areas in the country where even if a disadvantaged student gets the same grade as a non-disadvantaged student, then there is an extra level of economic disadvantage that sits on top of that. And what I would contend is that students are not stupid, nor are their families. And they know this. And what I found moving from North London to Sunderland was that when the local area doesn't provide the opportunities, And when there is this extra disadvantage on top of it, students don't engage with school because they know it isn't going to serve their interests. So I think that everything has to tie together, and people have to see the possibilities beyond school. And that isn't the same as simply beefing up careers advice. I have a big bee in my bonnet about this, because it's no good telling people go off and work in the media when there aren't any jobs. And I've had exactly that problem in Sunderland. People say, oh, there are media jobs in Sunderland. They are not media jobs in the way that they think they are media jobs. So we have to be honest with young people.
Fantastic, thank you. I completely agree about the tie-up across the system, and that report really kind of brought it home, I think, the fact that you can't be driving opportunity through education alone. Hitan, did you have anything to add? You mentioned the really important role of persistent poverty and also inequality in the attainment gap and what disadvantaged students were experiencing at school. Did you want to comment on the relative role of education policy versus wider welfare provision?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but I think 14 million people in the UK live in relative poverty. That's around a fifth. And I think, when you get into children, it's 1 in 3, if I remember correctly. So, the numbers are huge. And some work I did with the Social Metrics Commission, looking at our measures of poverty, actually showed that we underestimate the number of children and families who have a disabled person in the home. So once you sort of really clarify the costs around disability, that hugely drives up the numbers as well. So there's something about improved data to actually know where deprivation is, which I think is very, very important. And I think we underestimate the disability component. But when thinking about what are the welfare interventions, in a sense, let's sort of take stock of the political reality, which is, what we've got a centre-right government rather than a centre-left government. It's unlikely that certain kinds of welfare interventions are on the table. So I don't think it's worth spending a lot of time trying to pursue them right now. But this government has shown an interest in what they're calling levelling up, which at the moment I think is a slogan rather than a policy. It's not clear yet what they're trying to level up. But there clearly is some interest and sort of ambition behind that. So I think one of the things that needs unpacking is, are we trying to level up regions? Are we trying to level up individual people, i.e. targeting the very worst off, which is kind of what I'm talking about in terms of poverty, or leveling up of groups? And depending upon which of those you want to do, the policy interventions would look really rather different. But I think there's quite a lot of work to be done, and there's some shaping there for us to be able to do. So if collectively we were of the view actually that the focus should be on just individuals who are most deprived, rather than, as I say, levelling up has got a sort of regional feel to it at the moment, then that would change the nature of the policy interventions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Hitan. One of the things that we've kind of asked government ministers in the past has been those questions. What do you mean by levelling up, and what are you trying to achieve here? I think it also comes back to John's point as well about the role of absolute versus relative in terms of achievement, but also in terms of later life outcomes. Do we care about there being big gaps in the life outcomes of individuals from disadvantaged compared to affluent backgrounds, or do we just want to make sure that individuals across areas have a more kind of equal opportunity in terms of their absolute outcomes? And I think, we struggle with this in the Long Shadow of Deprivation report. I'm kind of with Ruth. I think you have to do both. I think you have to think about both. Otherwise, you end up with mass inequality. But I mean, it's a really excellent point, Hitan. Thank you for making it. I'm just going to move on and bring up the thorny topic of exams, because I don't want to spend too long on this, because there is a whole debate about the role of assessment next week in the IOE Debates events. But Ruth, you mentioned some of the downsides of assessments and suggestion that maybe we don't need GCSEs as part of the system. What do you see as a fair alternative, given all the evidence that alternative approaches to exams can be very problematic in terms of fairness?
So I just want to say I'm not against external exams per se. I think we've just got far too many of them. And my candidate for for slashing first is the GCSE, because I think it's become obsolete really in a system now where young people are required to stay in education trained till 18, and many do till 19 actually. So what would you replace that? Well, we do need assessment, ongoing assessment done by teachers to enable students and teachers to know how they're getting on, and areas in which they need to revise or improve. But externally, instead of replacing the GCSE for the individual, then what do they take with them to the next stage? I think you could go for something more like a record of achievement with a grade point average, and also looking more broadly than just academic achievements. And in fact, the report you alluded to when we looked at post-16 transitions, it's clear that a number of young people are starting their post-16 careers on a lower level of achievement than they've already gained. And that is partly because broader skills and talents that they might have and achievements outside of the formal academic curriculum aren't being recognised at all there. So something broader in achievement. And then I do think government, and this is probably the answer you were looking for, the governments need to know what's going on as well. So I think we should probably move to something like a sort of a sample system, a moderated sample of schools each year. So that we're looking at the same, a bit like, I suppose, a bit like PISA, we're testing a sample each year. So this system would be right for the individual, the teacher, to be right for moving on, and it would help governments to know how we're getting on as a system as well.
So one of the kind of challenges I think around making or GCSEs becoming obsolete is that while we still have the current system, at least for those students who progress on to higher education, GCSEs are a very important checkpoint in terms of forming those predicted grades. So I think, do GCSEs become more obsolete if we are brave enough to move towards a post-qualification admission system, and indeed a post-qualification application system where everyone has their A-level results before they make these big life-altering decisions, if we are to start to think about what comes before. Otherwise, you're basing this information on, quite subjective judgments all the way through the schooling process.
Yeah, a trust in teachers' judgment question here arises, but let's come back to that.
I think, we did a paper last year that showed it's not teachers' judgment that's off. It's just that some pupils have much noisier trajectories than other pupils, right? Mm-hmm. So you're asking teachers to do an impossible task by asking them to predict how pupils' trajectories look. Anyway, I'll stop ranting. John, I'm coming to you. How do you see this playing out in terms of the future of assessment?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm a new parent. I've just got a new daughter, and the system that Ruth was describing sounds ideal for me. This record of achievement. Well, look, we're a middle class family. I wasn't growing up. I was a free school meals kid, and as a result, didn't have things like piano lessons or expensive Lambda exams like my wife. But if you're of means, you can fill your record of achievement with that sort of stuff. That sounds great. So we'll have that, please. Teacher assessment. Well, we know that there's unconscious bias against Black Caribbean kids, working class kids, affinity biases that come in. Whereas my daughter's white and is going to be middle class. So the teacher assessment, yes, please, I'll have that as well. That sounds great. Look, obviously I'm being a little bit facetious, and I think that there is like some common ground here between Ruth and I. I think that uncoupling this sort of accountability from the examinations and moving to a sampling system, I'd agree. I think that's a smart move. Moving maybe to like a 3-year average, I'd agree that would be a smart move. I think that what we shouldn't do is replace examinations with forms of assessment that are less valid, less reliable, and less fair. And as I said, much more easily bought. If you can, there are stories already appearing in the press about tutors who are being sacked by families because they're refusing to write the coursework for this year's replacement to GCSE exams. Now, they're just the ones that we're hearing about. Undoubtedly, there are thousands of essays being written by tutors at the moment for those that can afford it. So I think that, look, I'm as sad as anybody else that exams seems to be the best way that we have to assess kids. But if from a social justice perspective, exams do seem to be the smartest choice. The 16 point, in terms of abolishing GCSEs, I guess the trouble is, so there are 2 points. One, as you mentioned, is the university or admission, or if you don't go to university, just jobs. That having that useful sort of like data there. Post admission, post assessment qualification admission might solve that. I think that the other problem really though is that, as I said, that actually provides some really useful data for kids as well as teachers. So I teach, I'm a primary teacher, but I also taught an A-level for a couple of years. We're an all through school, and that GCSE can be really useful as like a starting point for a conversation with a kid where they really want to pursue a subject, for example, but maybe they got a grade 3 in the subject. Now, I don't think that should mean that they don't get to pursue the subject at A-level, for example, but it's useful to say, look, this is something that clearly is like you found challenging at GCSE. It's going to be a struggle if you take this at A-level where there's going to be a big jump. It's useful to have that sort of conversation. If we the other thing is, if we abolish 16 examinations at 16, and then kids go on to, for example, an apprenticeship or maybe even A-levels, we'll have the qualifications in that sort of like narrow sort of like subjects that are taken, but we've got no idea how they did in the other subjects along the way. So I think that that would be my response to that I'm sorry to be sort of like, I didn't think that when I went into teaching that I'd be sitting on a debate defending exams. I really didn't. but I think that they are just from a social justice perspective, I think that we have to keep them.
Okay, thank you, John. So we're going to move on to some questions from the audience now. And Sammy, I'm coming back to you for this one. And this is related to something I wanted to ask you, so I'm glad someone else has. You have, I guess, a kind of fatalistic view, I suppose, of what education can do in many respects, given your recent research findings. If it is all about poverty, how do we explain those who succeed against the odds? And let me tie that into what we've seen happen in London schools. Can we take any lessons from what happened in London schools, over the past 2 decades?
Yeah.
And I'm going to throw one more at you as well. Saying that schools can't change anything is very much focused on the system as it stands. Is it not fair to say that if a system, we could alter that system and that might not have the same results?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think my first response is I feel a little bit like John, shock at myself sounding fatalistic, because I'm normally a pretty optimistic kind of guy, and I do believe schools could make a huge difference. But what I don't believe is that we should be loading every responsibility onto them. Right? I think that's where I'm at with it. It's about saying to schools that, look, this is not your fault. Do what you can, but there is something fundamental here. And I think it's absolutely right that there are things we could do structurally that will help. I'll just address that idea of the students who do buck the trend. I think it's so important that we make a distinction between aggregate and individual. Right? And I was talking to someone the other day, about why does poverty mean poor grades? And they said, well, it doesn't. I know plenty of poor people who get good grades. And I said, I didn't say, why do poor people get bad grades? It's why does poverty lead to bad grades? And that's the distinction there. Poverty in an aggregate has impacts, which mean, if you think about it in terms very simply of the exam date, if you are from a poor background, you are more likely to have other stresses in your home and other events happening, having to do things like part-time jobs, et cetera, all of which decrease the amount of time you can revise for your exam. That's a dead simple way in which poverty impacts. But equally, that's not the same as saying it always does. It just means in aggregate, it has more of an impact. So there are loads of examples I could point to of fantastic students who do this. It's just that they're battling against a little bit more. And on that note, I'd just point out something which I often complain about, which is we have moved to a system whereby we judge schools on progress. Why do we not judge students on progress? A school that gets all its GCSE C grades or up to A grades at A level is seen to be outstanding. But a student with an A grade at A level and a C grade at GCSE is simply seen to have a slightly worse CV than an equivalent who's got an A grade at GCSE. So there's a lot of inconsistencies there in the way that we approach things. Now, I'm losing track of my 3 bits of my question. So
I threw a lot at you. That's okay.
So I've answered about the outlier and the fatalist
London?
thing. I think that's right. So there are things that we can do in the system to change. And I think for me, the number one point is I agree with John. I think exams are good for social justice, but I think it's what you're testing the kids on. And I give you the example here that in Sunderland, in my school, we had an issue a few years ago where students unexpectedly did very badly in a particular question on the English exam. We called the exam, we looked at the papers, and we discovered that the stimulus text mentioned Piccadilly Circus, and our students had written about lions, tigers, and acrobats. And that gives you a perfect example of why we've got to be very careful about what we put in exams. So that would be my first port of call, is we need to change the things we're putting in exams, and we need to adapt them to reflect ability and capacity rather than cultural capital, right? Now, that's not to say we don't give kids cultural capital. It's just that we don't make it fundamental to the assessment regime, okay? Now, the last part of the question, I've lost track of again. I do apologize. Where are we?
No, that's okay. That's okay. I mean, there was a question related to, can we learn anything from the successes, for example, in London?
Yeah. Now, that is a great question because I was there. My 12 years in London were the London Challenge. I started in 2001 and I left in 2013. And I think it's a mirage. I think that it was about demographic change. I think it was about, increased funding. I think it was about changes in the system. I think there was all sorts of stuff there. The thing that isn't a mirage is dead simple and slightly depressing. I worked in a challenging school in Camden. And in that school, in the English department, I was one of 3 teachers who had an English degree from Oxford University in one department of 8 people, right? And the same was replicated across the school. In my current school, I'm the only person. I'm the only person with a degree from Oxford, full stop, right? If I then look at the students, my students in that school, I had children of cabinet ministers, children of spin doctors, children of actors. You know, I'd see them on telly one night and then I'd talk to them in parents' evening. I have none of that in my current school, and yet they are exactly the same pupil premium, right? London has a cultural context which superpowers it. And there is no getting away from that, and that has huge benefits for students, even when they're from the most disadvantaged backgrounds.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Sammy. That's really helpful. Let's move on to focus in a little bit on the pandemic, if we can. One of the other poll questions that we asked via Twitter was, how do you feel about the narrative of learning loss and catch up? And 21% responded saying it's appropriate, while 79% said it's unhelpful. We've had a question from Tammy Campbell, who said, how do speakers define learning and what exactly has been lost? I know that we've all been quite careful not to use these terms, but Ruth, maybe I can come to you to answer that question slightly more directly.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. And I think our debate at the moment is too superficial and not connected enough to what both to different ages and what learning, is for at each of those different kind of ages. So and also we've got an idea here that learning has to happen at a certain time, and if you haven't done it then, you're never going to do it again. So I think that's why one of the main reasons I think this loss and catch up is unhelpful. So I think we need a different notion of that. People learn across the life course. The school learning that we do now at a particular time is important for various reasons. It might be important because it's curriculum content that you need as a building block to move on to the next bit or to move on to the next phase. But for some children, for the very youngest children who have got, in a sense, more time over their life to catch up, the things that might be most important for them are not formal learning. They might, it might be about communication, about relationships, about confidence, those kind of things. So I can't answer the question for all ages and all children, but I think we've got to think much more, about curriculum, about content, and why we need stuff at what point and can it be done later. And so we need a much more, long-term and kind of nuanced approach to this. I don't know if that, hopefully that gets to something what Tommy was asking.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Ruth. Thank you. Hitan, staying on the topic of the pandemic just for a second, I've got a question from Michael J. Larkin, who said, will the economic inequality driven by the pandemic drive the gap for many years to come? And what are the implications of this?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is it's difficult to know because forecasting is always a real nightmare. We barely kind of can look back and quite understand what's happened, let alone look forward. But I think what is clear, when you have these kinds of ruptures in society like the pandemic, they do historically tend to exacerbate and solidify inequalities. So I suppose the way I would think about it is that if you leave it standing still, it will have made things worse. And also, of course, it has hit the economy, which makes it harder to address as well. Having said all that, I think what's interesting is kind of looking back over history to examples where moments like this have been moments for change or not. So if you look at Spanish flu, which was a kind of comparable tragedy, actually nothing much changed afterwards. If you look at 19th century cholera, there was a mood for change, much more move to kind of policy around public health boards and so on. But actually that all slipped back because there wasn't really public support for change. Whereas I think the kind of key example, which everyone knows, is World War II, Beveridge, the formation of the welfare state. And I think an interesting question is which of those three kind of possibilities are we in? And my own view is that we're not quite at a Beveridge moment, but actually some of the conditions are there. There is some public support for not flipping back to quite how things were before. I was on a Demos commission looking at kind of public attitudes, and that's definitely there. I think there is some goodwill from political leaders to create something different. I mean, this narrative of Build Back Better. But I think we're just all exhausted. And I think that's the real problem, that, just responding to this pandemic has been so difficult. At some level, we just want it all to go away and kind of flip back to normal. And so I think that is, in a sense, the challenge. And I think for all of us who might be influencing the policy community, and I think this is the job we were trying to do with the review that we did on the COVID decade, was to just outline some directions of travel post the kind of immediate health crisis to say, and this is where we need to go next, not just to flip back to normal.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, Hitan just mentioned kind of thinking about influencing the policy community. We've got a great question here about influence, how influence works between research and teaching, on how well or not do the teaching and research professions relate to one another in the quest to overcome the impact of inequalities on educational outcomes. John, do you want to take that one on? How do you feel about this interrelation between research and teachers?
This was actually the subject of my master's thesis. So that's serendipitous, isn't it? And really just like quite a sad story in terms of the relationship between school improvement, the field, the discipline of school improvement, and then educational effectiveness research, the body of sort of what we know, and those two spheres not really talking to each other. So I think that. But I do think that there are some green shoots. I do think that we, over the last decade, there has been much better cross-sector working. We're on a panel right now with practicing teachers and educational researchers and academics. Like there's also some like real sort of like a groundswell of application of research to classroom practice. So. Over a few years ago, I was on the expert group that put together the early career framework, and that really was an attempt to try and codify what we currently know about teaching, learning, curriculum, assessment, special educational needs, culture, relationships, the sorts of things that teachers should have as a shared body of knowledge, and that every new teacher will be given that. So they'll be inducted into the profession by being taught that and having a chance to translate it into their classroom practice. It doesn't exist at the moment. If you go into any school in the country and ask that teacher and walk into a classroom and sort of, this is an exercise like, what can you guarantee that teacher will know in terms of like evidence-based practice? And I don't think that there, maybe like Vygotsky or Piaget or something like that, something that's decades old. Otherwise, like we currently, I think, are not an evidence-informed profession. Arguably, never can be. But I do think that there are. The sort of like positive steps forward in terms of us beginning to act, making better bets in terms of educational research and evidence-informed practice.
Thank you, John. Thank you. It's reassuring to hear that from the early careers framework. Sammy, what's your take on this? You've got a foot in both camps.
Yeah. I mean, I love having a foot in both camps. I think it's a really valuable thing, and it informs my teaching a lot. However, what I think the caution I have is the comments that come back again and again. So I think with the EEF, the research that they disseminate is brilliant, but they themselves have pointed out that the only research program which they've managed to scale up is the Magic Breakfast. And all the actual teaching and learning ones, what they find is when you do it at scale, it loses effectiveness because people no longer commit to doing it in a nuanced and subtle way that's responsive to the local context. So I think that it's about, I suppose if I think the most valuable thing for research for me as a teacher, if I'm honest, is actually telling the kids about it. So I spend quite a lot of time talking to the students. For example, I tell them, why do you think it is that those amongst you here who have free school meals might do less well than the others? And we talk quite openly about it. We look at some of the social mobility stuff. And I find that very, very powerful, and particularly in Sunderland, because they have such a poor opinion of their local environment. And it's interesting to kind of share with them the ways in which it isn't quite as bad as they think.
Oh, excellent. So some kind of compulsory sociology modules on the curriculum going forward. I'm all up for that. That sounds great. So we are running out of time, and I wanted to ask you one last question each, and it's going to be one of those short, snappy ones. So get your answers ready. But if you could implement one policy to reduce the attainment gap, what would it be? And Ruth, I'm coming to you first. One, not 10.
If I had to do one, it would have to be the holistic cross-government strategy for equalising childhoods.
I like that. Thumbs up. Hitan?
Yeah, I think it would be tackling persistent poverty. And there's obviously different routes by which you'd do that, but I think that would be the focus.
What would you do? What would you do? What would be the policy? I'm going to push you.
Well, personally, I think it would be redistribution. But, that's just a very personal view. But as I say, there are multiple routes.
Fantastic. John, over to you.
It's a really good question. If there was one thing, so I think building on Ruth's point earlier, the group that I'm most concerned about is probably 5 to 7-year-olds. I think that, as she said, those that are the youngest academically have time to catch up, and those that are the oldest have been able to sort of take on some independent learning. I'm massively worried about the social, emotional communication skills of those children, because they haven't been with other children. And so I think that I would have a policy around ensuring that those sort of young children have a chance to build back their sort of social and emotional interactivity.
Yeah, brilliant. That speaks to the idea that this is all, skill begets skill, and this is all things that we build on all through life, and early years does matter a lot there. Sammy, you've had the longest chance to think about this.
Yeah. So, and I've heard everyone else. So what I'm going to say is I would do any of those things, but because they've been said, I'm actually going to say extend the pupil premium into 16 to 19. Because we have not mentioned the fact that there is a vast gap in A-level achievement, which we don't even know because we don't record it. Why don't we record it? Why don't we fund colleges and post-16 institutions to actually address disadvantage? And I'm saying this because I would like everyone who's listening to make a big noise about this, because this is our ask for catch-up and recovery right now. And it's what I'm trying to get across to DFE and various other organizations. Post-16 pupil premium.
So that's 4 excellent policy recommendations that not only span the life course, they span the entirety of childhood. They're broad. We're dealing with poverty here. I'm grateful, and that's wonderful responses. Thank you. It's our time's up. Unfortunately, I could speak to you guys all evening, I think. But let me just thank the audience for joining us this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. It's harder when you're not in a room with people to get a sense of that. But hopefully it's been a lively and interesting debate. And thanks, of course, to all 4 of our speakers for all of your contributions this evening. Fantastic, interesting perspectives, all evidence-led. Brilliant. Join us next week for the next IOE debate. And until then, thank you very much. Have a lovely evening.